Okay, so I noticed some noise coming from the rear of the car, so I took it to the Chevy dealer, had them check it out, and they verified that it was wheel bearings. And so they gave me an estimate. Of $620 to replace the one wheel bearing. Okay. And then they tried to sell me 4 new tires, which I don't really need. But anyway, $620 to install one wheel bearing. So I went online to Napa and I was able to get 2 wheel bearings. So for both rear wheels for $320. They're originally $200 per bearing, but they had a discount going on, so I got them for $320 for 2 of them. So for about half price, I was able to get 2 wheel bearings, and that was my incentive for doing it myself. That's usually how it works. I find out what they want to fix it, and then I realize, hey, I could do that myself and save a lot of money, and I actually kind of enjoy doing it, so that's the reason why I'm doing it. Okay, so first of all, got my floor jack ready to go, and I got my breaker bar. So first I have to, before I lift the car up off the ground, I have to break these lug bolts loose. So for my 2017 Cruze, I'm using a 19mm socket to break loose the lug nuts. And then once I do that, then I will jack it up and remove the lug nuts and the whole wheel completely. Okay, so I've got the wheel removed, and I've got my magnetic parts dish here. Works fantastic for keeping track of stuff. So I have that nearby when I take a part off. I drop it in there and I don't lose it. Okay, so in order to get to the bearing, which is behind here, I have to remove this and also this. This is the brake caliper, which grabs onto the rotor. So this brake caliper has to come off in order to let this rotor come off. So to get this off, there's 2 bolts that come in from the back, one on the top, one on the bottom. And the bolts are 15mm. So with a 15mm socket, take those bolts off. And then once I get that out of the way, I have to remove the rotor, and the rotor is kept in place with a Torx screw, and it's a Torx what is it, a T30 Torx screw. So we get that in there, break it loose, and remove that. So let's get this brake caliper removed first. So this is the first bolt right here, easy to see. Get in there with the 15. Use an extension on the socket. And then the other bolt, I don't know if we can see it very well here. It is right there. So just next to this guy. right there. So I'll take those 2 bolts out. Okay, so now you can see better. There's the second bolt, and the first bolt is up there. Right back there. That one and that one. That holds this whole caliper on. Once we get those bolts out, we'll be able to take this thing off. Also, what needs to be disconnected is the parking brake cable. That's right here. Comes here with this cable, and it's pushed into this bracket here, just like that. And then you can see the cable goes back here and ends in this like steel ball on the end of the cable. And that whole thing is into this spring-loaded bracket that has to be pushed forward. Has to be pushed forward that way so that that ball with the cable can drop down and be disengaged. So this thing here has to be pushed forward that way. Takes a little bit of doing, but once you get it over, you can loosen up this cable, this ball end of the cable, and it'll drop down below and it'll release the cable, and then you can pull the cable out of this bracket and put it out of the way for the time being, because that is connected to the caliper, which doesn't allow the caliper to move out as far as you need it. So that's another thing we've got to do. So I'll take those 2 bolts out and I'll disconnect that cable. Okay, so now we've got the caliper taken off, and I've placed it on this box. Reason being is if you don't place it on something, it'll end up hanging by this flexible brake line hose, and you don't want to damage that, because then you'd have big problems with having to fix and bleed your brakes. So some guys will wire these things up to hang them. I just find it easier just to put something there and place it on the box so that there's no strain on the brake line while we're doing the repair. So the next thing we got to do is take out 4 bolts that go through this bracket here, as part of the frame here, into the wheel bearing housing. Now here's the one that I took off the passenger side. See, and you can see it has 4 bolts that bolted on to the car frame. So that's what we have to get out. I have to get out 4 bolts that go through this thing and go into the back of the bearing case thing. Okay, so you can see 1 bolt right there. You can't really see very well here, but there's 4 more in there. And what I found doing the passenger side was you can either try to get to these bolts like this, reaching around the shock absorber, which is a real pain in the neck, or the simple solution is to remove this bolt, this bottom bolt that holds the bottom of the shock absorber on. It's 19, or is it an 18? Yeah, it's an 18 millimeter socket. So take that bolt out, and then once that bolt's out, you can compress the shock absorber up and push it out of the way, and then you have real easy access to those 4 bolts in there. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to take that shock absorber bolt off. I'm going to move the shock out of the way, and then I'm going to take off those 4 bolts. Oh, but before I do that, I still need to remove that Torx screw so that this thing will come off. Before I take the wheel bearing part out, I need to take the rotor off. So let's do that. So we've got our Torx T30 socket ready to go. It's a matter of putting it in there and turning it counterclockwise. The only issue though is that when you turn it counterclockwise, the thing wants the whole, hub wants to turn. So in order to keep that from happening, I stick a breaker bar in there so that it can't go. And then when you're turning it, you should be able to break it loose. One trick I've also learned is that before you try to loosen one of these guys up, it's a good idea to put the socket in there and then tap the end of it with a hammer just to try to loosen up the threads of that thing. Just shock the threads so that it breaks loose easier. So we're going to do that and get that out of there. Okay, so now with the rotor removed, you can see where we took that bolt out that was holding the rotor in place. So now you can see the bearing case that we're trying to remove, and you can see there's two of the bolts going through from the back, like I said, and there's two more down there. So now from the back side, after we get this guy, the shock absorber out of the way, we should be able to remove those 4 bolts, and then this whole thing will come out, which is the thing we want to replace. Okay, so I took this bolt out, which is what went through the shock absorber. I'm just going to stick this back in here and keep it out of the way so I don't lose it. And then I was able to compress the shock absorber up and pull it out of the way, see? So I can get to these bolts. You can see them in there, all 4 of them. See how much easier it is to get to them now? And then you just use your 15mm socket. Get those guys out of there. 4 of them. So let's pull those bolts out. Okay, so got the bolts out and I was able to remove the hub. Okay, so that's there. Well, one thing you got to remember too and be careful of is when you take the hub off, that's what holds the dust shield on. So if you can remove that, get that out of the way for now. But now also there's a speed sensor right there. See that? That's what this thing is. And that is connected right there with a screw into this metal housing, which is also held in place by the hub being bolted on. So after I took these bolts off, I put 2 bolts back in from the back just to hold this housing in place so that speed sensor doesn't get damaged by hanging loose again, just like the brake hose that we put on the box, so that brake line wouldn't get ruined. We're gonna keep these bolts in place to keep this speed sensor from being yanked on and damaged. So we'll just keep those bolts in place until we put the new hub on, and then once we bolt them on, that'll be okay. Just always have to remember to put the dust shield on before you put the new hub on. Let's see if I remember to do that. Something else that I like to do when I'm working on these kind of projects is when I take the hardware off, I always take them over to my bench grinder that has a wire wheel on it, and I just clean up all this rust that is on the threads. You can see this thing bolts through the bracket, and then this is stuck outside in the elements and it gets rusty. So then when you're removing it, or if you wanted to put it back in now, you'd be fighting all this rust in the threads. So I like to clean all those threads up first. It only takes a second on the bench grinder with the wire wheel on it to clean these bolts up. Makes it a whole lot easier. You can pretty much finger tighten them, put them all together really fast like it's all brand new. Also, I'm going to use Loctite thread locker when I put it back together, because these kind of things tend to, you know, be subject to vibration and they can end up working themselves loose, which you don't want. So I'm going to clean up all my bolts, and then when I reassemble, I'm going to use thread locker. Okay, so now I've got my bolts all cleaned up, ready to reuse. And all I got to do is put a little thread locker on them. Just like that. Really just need it where the threads are going to be engaging. I like to make sure it goes all the way around. So I'll do that for each one, and then I'm going to feed it through the back, through these 4 holes, and then make sure my dust cover or dust shield is put in place. That, and then put my new hub in place and bolt it in. That's what we're gonna do. Okay, so we got the new bearing hub installed with the 4 bolts coming from the back, and made sure we put the dust shield in before we put the rotor on, and we inserted our Torx screw to keep the rotor in place. And now we're ready to put the caliper back on, brake caliper, which goes on right here, bolts in with 2 bolts. And I got to make sure I put my parking brake cable back in place. I noticed that when I took it out, it came off of these little brackets here that hold it in place. And make sure that's right back where it goes. So that'll be ready to plug into the caliper. So after I get the caliper in, I guess I'll put the shock absorber back on and go from there. All right, now we got the caliper bolted back on. We got the parking brake reinserted so the ball is where it belongs. That is plugged into that bracket. It's routed correctly over these things. Got the shock absorber reattached, bolted in, and everything looks good. All we gotta do now is put the wheel back on, and we're done. Okay, so all back together now. Okay, now that it's all done, I wanted to kind of recap what it was all about. I went to the Chevy dealer, had them do a diagnostic on why I was getting rumbling sounds out the back of the car. So they checked it out and they told me needed bearings. And for the diagnostic, they charged me $159.50. Then they gave me an estimate to replace 1 bearing for $620 plus tax. So I assume the second bearing, if I do have them do both of them, would be another $620 plus tax. So that would be a total of $1,399.50. But I was able to buy the new bearings at Napa or $344. So I ended up saving myself $1,055.50 approximately. So it took a few hours of my time, but I enjoy the work, and saving $1,000, I don't know, that makes me happy. So time to go take a test drive, make sure everything's okay.